know each other longer than we care to remember. And as I'm sure you read from Edward's email, Miri is a lecturer in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford University and lectures in Modern Judaism. And we're going to have an evening, Miri. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. And I thought we'd have a kind of roving discussion about the kind of things you're interested in as a researcher, because I know you're interested in British Jewry and in Orthodoxy and gender issues. So what's the do you have a kind of underlying approach to what you're doing in the research that you're doing, your interests? If you want to kind of share with us, that'd be lovely.
I guess the thing that drives my research the most, more than anything else, is questions to do with religious authority. I'm really interested in the development of modern Judaism and the sort of descent into denominationalism. And my particular interests lie in studying the development and sort of continuing changes that characterize Orthodox Judaism in particular. And that's where, as I say, my interest really more than anything else focuses on questions of religious authority, because that's where it strikes me that there is the most to learn, really, to understand about why Orthodoxy is taking the shape that it is, how it has come to be what it is, and where there could be scope to identify possibilities for change.
Okay, so when you say religious authority, what do you mean by that? Because that's a huge thing.
Yeah, and it is a huge thing. But I guess, so the two key things that I look at, that I've spent quite a long time now looking at, that drive most of my sort of different areas of research, are questions of revelation, how we approach notions of Torah min Hashamayim and what their impact is on the interpretations of halakha that follow from that, and questions of gender and how the challenge of gender really cuts at the heart of Orthodox efforts to maintain its chain of tradition unaltered. And both of those two areas really come at their heart, revolve around questions of authority, questions about how we're to understand really the scope for a halachic Judaism, however we're to interpret that, to adapt, to have the flexibility to be able to respond to different circumstances. And
it's interesting because a lot of your, well, from what I've read of your stuff, it was about the history of rabbinic leadership and authority as opposed to the kind of the more philosophical side of it. So you were looking at Hertz and Yitz, Greenberg and Louis Jacobs and all this kind of stuff in terms of how, when they made the public statements, how they were reacted to. But that's more, it seemed more of a kind of historical, or how political authority was wielded, as opposed to actually the theological, can we do this approach? Which do you know what I mean? Like in other words, you weren't looking at hundreds of sources of Shemaim or stuff. You were looking more about how it was when these rabbis tried to present it, what happened to them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think the truth is that my more recent work has moved away from that to some extent.
Okay, it's just I don't know about.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I guess there's some articles that have been published, but the real sort of shift comes over in the book that I've been working on, which is currently with the editors now at the Littman Press, Littman Library, which is a study of it's a study of Louis Jacobs, but really it uses Jacobs' theology as a springboard to consider the challenge of contemporary theology. It's called Louis Jacobs and the contemporary quest for a Jewish theology, something like that. I don't know. The title's gone through so many iterations.
Right.
I think it was on the advertising, the correct title. But I mean, really, the heart of what the new book is about is precisely actually getting away from the sort of more sociology and history oriented approach, which I think certainly characterized my first book on Orthodox Judaism in Britain. It's why I welcome Harry's book on Louis.
Yes, Harry's here tonight. I was going to mention exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it doesn't compete. Like they're complementary rather than competing against one another, because precisely what I've tried to do which was not necessarily my intention when I started the book, but where I've ended up is actually, as I say, using Jacob's theology as this springboard for thinking about the challenge of trying to construct contemporary faith today. And my argument is that for all the challenges that we can identify in Jacob's thought from a variety of different perspectives, actually what I'm trying to suggest is that there are some really useful building blocks that can be drawn out from his thought, which actually I think can be particularly helpful for us when we think about the challenge of the quest, as Louis would have referred to it.
Okay, I mean, Harry, you're there, and feel free at any point to make comments, Harry, because, you know, we recognise you both here, and you wrote some great stuff in the book. So you're talking about theology, but you also talked about for scope for change. So what are these building blocks? Because in my world, and you know, we've always talked about this, is that the world of theology is a world apart from the world of actual practical Judaism, and they don't really overlap that much, right? That's my opinion, whatever. But you're saying that what building blocks are we talking about, and what do you mean?
Well, so I mean, I guess at its real heart, going back to real basics, I think what we can draw out from Jacob's theology is the central. What again? Let's take a step back. What Jacobs was trying to do, and this is exactly something that Harry deals with in his book, was by no means go and set about trying to set up a Masorti Judaism in Britain. That was the antithesis of what he was after. He was trying, with a variety of different factors involved, to influence Orthodoxy. That was where his spiritual home lay, and that was where he was interested in trying to bring about change. And what he was trying to argue was the centrality of theology in achieving that goal of trying to facilitate a way for an Orthodox Judaism to continue to speak to contemporary Jews. And that was why he defended the value and importance of theology, because that was what provided the tools for thinking about Judaism. And then what I'm suggesting we can identify as building blocks in Jacob's thought is the primacy of three particular sort of components of Judaism, which provide, if you want, the anchors that enable you to retain the links with, I mentioned, this idea, well-established idea of a train of tradition, so that ground you in your Judaism, whilst yet enabling you to fly. If you've got these anchors, you're still able to fly. And so I suggest that this is a sort of committed yet questioning Judaism that can develop. And the building blocks for that, the three building blocks that I suggest we can draw out from Jacob's theology. And again, here I should emphasize, this is what I'm drawing out from Jacob's rather than something that he necessarily how he explicitly set it out, are the centrality of the retained role of ritual. And again, this is many people who've spoken about Jacob's comment on his retained strict adherence to halakha. So the first building block is the importance of ritual. And the point is, again, when we think about Jacob's, whatever criticisms he was willing to direct at Orthodox halakha, one of the things that's striking, one of the things that he's criticized for by those who wanted him to create the sort of non-fundamentalist halakha, which he suggested it was possible to construct, is that he didn't engage in halakhic psak. He avoided it quite avidly. One of the most striking examples is in his A Tree of Life, where he talks about the challenge of the mamzer. And he identifies possible remedies for that, the halakhic problem of the mamzer, or the moral problem of the halakha of the mamzer, but refused to actually advocate a means of getting around the problem. He laid out the groundwork and refused to actually take the next step and issue the psak. So ritual is central. Second is Torah study, and that relates to what you're saying about your initial framing of the question. We can't think about theology without the Torah study. You have to go back to the sources and engage with those sources, because that's where you gain the ability to understand the flexibility and possibilities for creativity that exist within the tradition, but which just haven't necessarily been chosen. And the third component is community. So that's the necessity of understanding that as much as he advocated the primacy of the theological quest of trying to find your own path into Judaism, you had to do it while staying within the parameters of the community, which again imposes certain limits. So you can go to the sources and you can identify the possibility for change, but actually he didn't want that change to necessarily happen if it took you away from the community. And that relates to his reluctance to engage in the psak, because he precisely tried to argue that you had to bring the community as a whole along with it. And so those three building blocks, I would suggest, create these possibilities, these anchors for this model of committed questioning.
It's interesting because those seem like blocks for pragmatic change as opposed to theological statements about how you do change. So are you focusing? Well, I'm focusing on, like, because I thought you were going to talk about actual particular sources or particular ways of reading, in terms of the Rambam's approach or Hirsch. But what I'm hearing from you is about how you make change actually work and take hold.
Absolutely, because again, I guess that goes back to my understanding of the task of theology, which again I draw from Jacobs, but it has wider roots. So I mean Jacobs. I don't think I've got it. I could get it. 1 second, I'll get it easily enough, because it's the classic statement in his Jewish theology, in the beginning of his Jewish theology, where he defines the task of theology, and he says. While the historian asks what has happened in the Jewish past, the theologian asks the more personal question: what in traditional Jewish religion continues to shape my life as a Jew in the here and now? The historian uses his skills to demonstrate what Jews have believed. The theologian is embarked on the more difficult, but if realized, more relevant task of discovering what it is the Jew can believe in the present. So, precisely what I see as the task of theology is actually constructing an account of Jewish teachings that can resonate with individuals without taking them away from community. And to achieve that, a good theology has to, on some level, be transmissible. If it's a personal theology that you can't transmit, then it's not a very constructive theology. And on some levels, that's exactly what we could argue about Jacob's theology. It was a very personal theology. That was the original title of the book, actually, was my book, was Louis Jacobs, A Jewish Theology, or the Theology of a Jew, ? Because the whole thrust of where I was initially going was that his theology was actually very personal. And the problem, therefore, was that it was not transmissible. But exactly what I came to understand through my research, delving further, was that I thought, as I said, that there were important ideas that can be taken from his thought, which I think precisely speak to our contemporary age and focus not on, so again, the value of lofty ideas is all well and good up to a point, but the reality is we have to think about how to practically implement that and bring about the sorts of changes that can enable people to work out what it is that they can believe, which is.
So have you got examples of people you'd say in the last 30, 40 years, rabbinic Orthodox theologians or rabbis who actually have translated it? Like, would you say Soloveitchik or Yitz Greenberg or Sachs? Like, well, what would you say what are your models of here's things that go on, or Hertz, if you want to go back, because I know we're both huge fans of Hertz. So, but
yeah, I mean, I do think Hertz actually very much did. Sorry, my dog is trying to get out the study. Bear with me. It's the joys of Zoom.
Yeah, it's the wonder of COVID canines. They are taking over the world.
Indeed. Sorry.
Right.
Sorry. So yes. So I do think Hertz was a model of someone who understood the challenge of his time, and understood the pressure that imposed on trying to construct a response that acknowledged the challenge of the time, and sought to find a path through it. I mean, you could certainly say that about Rav Soloveitchik. I think, going back, a very strong influence on me formatively is Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. I think again, that's someone who recognized the challenge of the time and was constructive and creative in trying to think in theological terms about how to create a model for responding that acknowledged those challenges and offered a path that precisely worked from within the sources to suggest that there was more flexibility. And I would certainly put Greenberg in that category as well. Yitz Greenberg. But Greenberg, like Jacobs, was largely ostracized from Orthodoxy for being willing to challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Can we learn something from that, from the way that they both were ostracized, in terms of, is it too fast a pace, or Orthodoxy by its essence is averse to proper theology, and actually that's not the way to go? I'm asking the question. I don't know. I mean, the fact that it keeps happening. And even to an extent, Sachs, and and being aware of that issue is maybe we're saying actually that's not the way to go. Maybe you have to go other kind of ways. And even though Soloveitchik did do halacha, did do philosophy, he did do halacha, which made it maybe more palpable. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I think here we get to precisely the kind of the nub of the problem, which is that sorry, my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if I'm
okay. We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Cool. So what I was saying, the nub of my interest in Orthodoxy is the way in which it is it is such a constructed entity in itself. Mm-hmm. In terms of the way in which it has emerged as the defender of tradition in the modern world. And in doing so, it has lost and I guess this is very Jacobs, because this was one of his critiques. It has lost its historical consciousness. It has lost its awareness of the way in which the particular trajectory that Orthodoxy has followed reflects a response to the various challenges that the encounter with the modern world posed for Jews as a whole. And that's what led to, what I said earlier, this descent into denominationalism. And the reality is that there are alternative routes that could be taken within halachic Judaism, a Torah true Judaism, whatever term we wish to use, that actually offers a path that is not so focused on boundary marking. And I guess, again, going back to the forthcoming book, that's exactly one of the thrusts of what I'm interested in studying, the way in which, and we see that very clearly when we look at the history of British Jewry. British Jewry traditionally was absolutely dominated by its mainstream Orthodox institutions. Mm-hmm. But, here we are, Central Square, I'm talking in the context of this minyan, which is a proudly independent minyan, which sort of on some level is challenging the established institutions of British Orthodoxy. And more than that, the reality is those established institutions are shifting at a very rapid rate. And one of the reasons that they're shifting at a very rapid rate is because the approach of society as a whole to religion is altering in certain important ways. And on one level, that's actually been very positive for religion, because it's actually carved out a renewed space for religion in this, this idea of the fact that we're living in a post-secular age where we have progressed beyond the secularist challenge. There is a growing acknowledgement that we're not headed towards secularization. But at the same time, what that means for religion is in a state of flux. And I mean, you mentioned Rabbi Sachs. Clearly, that's one of the reasons why he was able to acquire such an international moral voice, because there is this yearning, this search for that religious moral voice, but there is a desire for that voice to fit in to a changed sort of context in which the role of established religions is increasingly under threat.
No, I can see that, but I see I actually see not that much change in terms of halakhic change in our community. So we have really good apologists, me included, trying to explain Judaism to the mainstream and to keep it going. But actually, for real halakhic change, I looked at Israel much more in terms of gender issues or identity issues. The really, or even biblical criticism, all those real areas. Yes, there's a little bit in New York in something, but it's really Israel that it's going on, and not much here. And I feel after the Jacobs affair, we are still, once bitten, twice shy in this community from going anywhere near that kind of thing. And Central Square is proudly independent, but privately very careful, about what it does. To be honest, I hope, feel free, any members, to challenge me on it. But, I think a lot of the members watching now would want the chief rabbi to be happy with most or nearly all of what we do. I mean, some not, whatever, but I think they'd want that. So people want to be mainstream and accepted. I remember in Kinloss, when they did a whole review about women in Judaism, that kind of stuff, a lot of women, old women, says to younger ones, we want our friends in Golders Green or Hampstead to respect us, So I'm not so sure. I don't know, maybe I'm cynical, but I can't see theology changing things here.
I think it's no. I mean, I completely agree with you that the path to change is well. On the one hand, British Jewry has never been a path breaker in anything. There was an absolutely wonderful article that I've quoted on a number of occasions that was written by Emanuel Jacobowitz before he became chief rabbi, when he was still in his pulpit in New York. It was during the tercentenary celebrations of the Jewish resettlement in Britain, and he lambasted British Jewry for its focus on the middle path. And I can't remember if it was in his installation sermon as chief rabbi, where he quoted from the Chafetz Chaim, who said that in the middle of the road only donkeys walk.
Right.
And he said that the focus on that middle path was absolutely destructive of creativity. And so the focus on the United Synagogue, on the chief rabbinate, on an approved singer's prayer book, and the organ of Anglo Jewry with the JC, all of these things, these served to crush religious creativity. And he suggested this was a bad thing before subsequently becoming chief rabbi.
Right.
But then again, to be fair, exactly what he did as chief rabbi, what was at the heart of his chief rabbinate, was education.
Right.
Because he recognized that the only way to get out of that focus on the mainstream, on being in the center ground, is actually to provide education. And that's what gives you the tools to understand that there are alternatives. Now, so what does that mean? So on the one hand, that means that, yes, British Jewry is behind. It is mired in its history of trying to not rock the boat, which has deep British influences which have led it down that role. But take Limmud. Limmud is actually this really creative model that has emerged from British Jewry. It's quite innovative precisely because it is something that has spread out very widely across the Jewish world as this educational model, which is inclusive, overtly non-denominational, and is just focused on that educational sort of pursuit over and above denominational line drawing. And that's showing the sort of pushback against the mainstream. But the other thing I'm saying in terms of what your questioning of the willingness to go against the mainstream, the bottom line is, look at the statistics of United Synagogue membership. From a high of in the high 70s% of the community being associated, being members, paying up membership dues to mainstream Orthodox institutions, we've now gone below the 50% mark.
Oh,
and
I agree, yeah.
the same applies within British society as a whole. The British society as a whole has ceased to value the role of established religion in the same way. And so that's why I'm saying I think in religious terms, British Jews are very much influenced by the wider society. But in terms of where the creativity is coming, it's absolutely it's coming from Israel, because they don't have the same sorts of restraints that we have here.
But what's
more
interesting,
than that,
yeah. But what's interesting,
well, I was going to say, just
yeah, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say that this is the other challenge of Zoom. What I was going to say is one of the reasons why there is this creativity that is possible in Israel is because the approach to the Haredi community amongst Dati Leumi communities is so very different. There isn't the same respect in Israeli Dati society for Haredi. You know, we see it even more so right now in terms of COVID challenges. But there isn't the same willingness to just accept that Haredi rabbinic leadership is the ideal and everything else represents a compromise. And that creates, I think, a lot more scope for creativity.
And absolutely, and they have strength in numbers, and they have yeshivot and schools and everything. But here, we hardly have anything of that. And you know, I wonder, I look at Limud, you know, of 20 years of alternative ways of looking at things, and it hasn't affected Jewish schools. It hasn't affected the way United Synagogue mainstream does Jewish education. And it seems that actually, even when there's attempts at creativity, it still, for whatever reason, does not bump into the mainstream, and it separates. And I can't see United Synagogue fundamentally changing. It's gradually getting smaller, and yet is completely unwilling and fearful of embracing in any way creativity in these different areas.
No, I agree. My hope.
I mean, I apologize to members for being so cynical, but if you ask me honestly, that's what I see. You know, I don't see an excitement about these. Oh, let's build on that. It's rather let's kind of handle it or try and control it or reject it even.
Yeah. I completely agree. Precisely what I see happening in British Jewry is the slow marginalization and waning influence of those established institutions and the growth of alternatives.
Well, have they grown those alternatives? I wish they had more.
The most, yes, I wish they had more too, and it's a slow process. And again, it all comes down to education. Because the bottom line, and this goes back to what I was saying about these three roots of ritual, textual study, and community. Right. If you don't have the textual study, what can you achieve? How do you know how to justify the possibilities for change when you have the powers that be controlling and preventing that change? But the most obvious example to me that highlights the shifts that are taking place is the growth of partnership minyanim. And the clear efforts by the United Synagogue and the Chief Rabbinate to shut them down, and the very noticeable absolute inability successfully to do so. Why? Because there's no longer a willingness to just allow the United Synagogue and the Chief Rabbinate to control the trajectory of all of British Orthodoxy, and there is, you know, a growing willingness to stand up to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll put it up, and I want to ask you about Kishka Judaism as well, which you mentioned. But for me, what I was hoping is that when these alternatives happen, that they would begin to grow, and there would be a challenge. And what I see actually is not that there aren't enough people who are educated enough, knowledgeable to be able to do these alternatives. You know, we've had 2 women Orthodox rabbis in this country for a number of years now, and we've had 2 training and so on, and all of them, who I know, will just be sidelined. They will not get jobs within Orthodoxy. And maybe I'm completely wrong, on the cusp of huge change and involvement, but I see them shut out of synagogues, with one exception temporarily. I see them shut out of schools, and I can't see at any short time it beginning to change. So I don't want to be cynical. I just, you know, and I've been banging on this kind of stuff for years, but I just don't see it being taken up in a way that I would have liked it to be. And that worries me, and that makes me question. And so, you know, and I don't know if ultimately the Jacobs affair led to a much bigger nervousness and willingness to close it down, and this isn't the way to go. I don't know.
I think you're right that the Jacobs affair played a key role in transforming British Orthodoxy. That is what my first book on Orthodox Judaism in Britain was about. That it was the catalyst that facilitated a shift that was already taking place, but which brought it into being and really entrenched the control of the Bet Din, of the Chief Rabbinate, and created fear of what was possible, and the threat of being more creative in thinking about what was possible within Judaism. So on the one hand, I agree with the pessimistic assessment of the current state of things. on some levels. And it's interesting because, you know, I remember Daniel Reinhold and I, we used to, but before he left for YU, we used to meet up. It was, I think it was after he'd left LSJS, but he would, while he was at King's, and we used to meet up every so often, and we would lament, what are we doing sitting in British Jewry in Britain studying Judaism? Like, what fools are we? Why would we engage in this thankless task? And then he went and abandoned me and went to Golden Medina. And I was stuck here thinking, what am I doing? And so, you know, I certainly have those pessimistic roots. And yet, actually, as I say, I've almost surprised myself by the optimism that I do see in initiatives like the growth of Limud and the strength of Partnership Minyanim in refusing to bend over. And yes, it's a slow process. And you know, undoubtedly there is a need for education to continue. And there is, more than anything else, a need for more creative rabbis to emerge, male and female, in this country, to be willing to stand up and offer an alternative trajectory. But at the same time, I think there are the roots for some potential growth of an alternative model. And so I am, as I say, surprising myself by being willing to identify some signs of positivity.
Well, that's great. That's great. I can see Harry's got his hand up. Harry, you can take it if you want to ask questions. Harry, do you want to ask a question?
I want to be very, very pessimistic. You're talking about the lack of change in British Jewry and the need for education. I think back to the Jacob's Affair and to Jacob's own synagogue, where you have a great Talmudic scholar who's giving a Talmud shir every week, who's preaching theology from the pulpit, which makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to his congregation. His congregation remained as ignorant as they ever were of theology, as ignorant as they ever were of Talmud, as resistant to change in as much as they still had the old pre-war New West End liturgy in their synagogue. So I think that the problem is far more deeply rooted than just the three building blocks that you're talking about, Miri. I think the problem is in the British Jewry psyche, which I don't know how one overcomes, but I don't see how we can do anything about that, really.
Well, but then that's where I'm saying that the psyche of Britain as a whole is slowly but surely undergoing a very remarkable sea change. And we see that in all sorts of ways. I mean, think about Prince Charles. He's been saying for a long time that he doesn't want to be defender of the faith. He wants to be defender of the faiths.
Yes.
So there is undoubtedly this entrenched conservatism, which is part, again, quoting from Sachs, he mentions, I think it's in his Community of Faith, he talks about how one of his Jews college teachers used to refer to Minhag Anglia as Anglican Judaism. It's that umbrella, broad church approach, which is just about bringing people in, ensuring that they pay their membership dues, because that's the way in which British Jewry traditionally created the resources, the financial resources to be able to serve the community. So that's why synagogue membership and shechita became the two biggest concerns for the Orthodox establishment leadership, because that was how the money was created to actually serve the community. But that's shifting. There is more scope for creativity. And so, yes, the embedded roots of the community undoubtedly are in a very different model. But what I see is the possibility of there being a shift and a move away. It's certainly not there yet, though.
Okay, we have a lot of excitement and lots of questions. We've got from the teachers. Is it Michael or Sandra? Who's gonna say?
Hi, Shabbat. I just want to kind of broaden that. I'm a trustee of the Religious Education Council, and I kind of, we're involved in looking, I don't know if you know about the commission, there's been a very big commission looking at all different types of religion and what they're calling worldviews. And they even want to change the name of religious education now to religion and worldviews. And what they're trying to propose is looking at, for all religions and of course Judaism, as having, as you have explained and what I would feel, this whole landscape of different worldviews of Judaism, and that's really what they're proposing. So in a way, actually, that fits in very, very, very clearly with what you're proposing, and this whole idea that actually we all have our different worldview of Judaism, and what does worldviews really mean? So I wondered if you had anything to sort of add to that, or if you've been involved in that aspect of religion.
I haven't been involved in this commission or anything like that. Yeah, I've been involved in Oxford, for example, in the name change of the Faculty of Theology. I was shocked when I arrived in Oxford at quite how traditional and Anglican Oxford theology was. I came from Cambridge, and I thought, well, Oxford, Cambridge, you know, how much of a difference can there be between theology faculties? And yet I was astonished, because a number of the chairs in theology in Oxford are still associated with Anglican canonry. So you have to be ordained in the Church of England in order to take up a number of the chairs in the theology faculty, still to this day. Whereas Cambridge dispensed with that much longer ago. And so Cambridge actually naturally attracted more Catholics and other sort of alternatives, nonconformists to the Anglican Church, and so was much more creative. And the battle that occurred in theology in Oxford about changing the name to the Faculty of Theology and Religion was huge, because theology, just as many Orthodox Jews would argue that there's no such interest in theology in Judaism, so the Oxford Protestant Anglican theologians argued that theology rightly was just about Anglican thought and should not be broadened to take in that wider approach. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say very briefly is also, it goes back to what I was saying about the way in which Orthodoxy developed. Orthodoxy developed in a sort of 19th century context in which Jews as a whole, certainly in sort of a modern Western European tradition, were increasingly encouraged to try to think about Judaism in terms of a religion box, rather than thinking in terms of a worldview and a way of life. And that encouraged a focus on trying to make Judaism in some way more compatible with the understanding of what religion represented in terms of the encounters with Christianity. And that goes back to what I was saying about the heightened role of synagogue membership in British Jewry, because synagogues across the denominational divides of Judaism came to be heightened in importance, because you expressed your Jewish identity in terms of religion by being a member of a synagogue which provided an equivalent to a church, rather than thinking about Judaism in terms of that all-encompassing way of life, in which actually public worship is only one small component of how you express your Jewishness.
Yeah, I think.
And so it's part of this whole shift that characterizes the development of modern Judaism.
Is your faculty involved with Callum St Gabriel? Do you know Callum St Gabriel? Catherine Wright, are you involved with her? From Oxford. Okay,
let's because I know there's Ben and Margaret and Evelyn will ask questions, so we'll go Ben first. So
I was interested in your comment that creativity is in Israel rather than here or in the States. Here I'm not surprised about, because we have a centrality of control. My perception was always that in the States, because they don't have a united synagogue and a chief rabbi, and the chief rabbi's bet in the same way, there was much more freedom for creativity. And certainly I've seen it where my daughter lives, that there's much more, there are far fewer boundaries. So the wife of the rabbi of the Orthodox shul teaches in the Masorti school. One of the other rabbis in an Orthodox school sends its kids to the Masorti school because it's perceived as a good school. There aren't the same barriers. And I'm surprised that there isn't more creativity or successful creativity there.
So I would say that there is creativity there, and again, it undoubtedly goes back to the fact that there is not the centralized model in either America or Israel that we see so dominant here. But the key difference is the continued authority that the Haredi community still retains over more modern, centrist, open orthodoxy, you know, whatever adjective we use to talk about those forms of orthodoxy that in my book, I actually introduce the idea of usefully thinking about orthodoxy in terms of an engagement spectrum. That the differences, the way we can best understand where the differences across the Orthodox spectrum relate to the willingness to engage with ideas outside of one's own Orthodox sphere. And what I'm saying about American Orthodoxy, apart from anything else, the descriptions that you provided about that flexibility between different communities is something that is possible much less in the major centers of Jewish life on the coasts, in New York and LA.
Am I wrong? I'm talking about LA.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'm surprised because you know there does tend to be still the influence of the Haredim over the Orthodox creativity, and that inhibits on some levels. But at the same time, I mean, you know, New York is where you have YCT, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, which is precisely trying to train open Orthodox. As I say, they're kind of changing their name. The question of adjectival sort of labels for Orthodoxy is a constant challenge. So you've got that. You've also got Yeshivat Maharat. So of course there is the creativity in America, but I think there's even more creativity that we can identify in Israel, and we're playing catch up. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, very briefly in that respect, which I meant to mention when Rafi asked me the question earlier, and which I've just been reminded of, is the role of the internet in changing and challenging all of that. And that has been exacerbated even more by our experiences of the last 10 months or so in ongoing lockdowns and the like, where we now increasingly have access to so much more content and ideas that cross not just geographical boundaries, but denominational boundaries. And I think that's having an enormous influence as well.
No, I think you're right. I'll make a comment on that before we go to Margaret, which is I think that here's what I think is going on, Miri, which is depressing, but well, it's different. So when I've taught in Switzerland a number of times, and they've got quite a full modern Orthodox, very learned community there, Wollishofen, and they're all reading the Torah.com, these alternative, you know, Zev Farber, modern readings of Torah, you know, biblical criticism, all that kind of stuff. And yet their practice is firmer than the United Synagogue. It's like, you know, it's right-wing modern Orthodox. And basically, they separated the two. They want to live practically as religious Jews with tradition, not changing any halachic things, but they want their minds to be free. And in a way, I think it's slowed down change because they get their fix of intellectual enjoyment through the internet reading quietly in shul, but they like the nostalgia of lovely tunes and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure if one is influencing the other. They've kind of divided in what I've seen. And there's lots of people who sit quietly and just read their book. You know, Michael Harris will write a book, Ralph Belovsky will have his theory, it's that kind of stuff, but it doesn't affect mainstream everything else. So I think there's a kind of split going on. I don't know. I mean, that's just what I'm beginning to see. I don't know if you've got an opinion on that. I've got Clive as well, but have you frozen, Moo, or is it me?
I mean, interesting.
You're back. Go on.
I'm back. Sorry.
You're back.
I was going to say, your comment reminds me of an article from a few years ago by Jay Lefkowitz on social orthodoxy. I don't know if you read it or if people on here have read it. It was a fascinating article which was talking about the appeal of being a member of an Orthodox community and the willingness, therefore, to abide by all of its halachic requirements without actually having any commitment to the underlying teachings, theology, going back to what we started talking about, on which that orthodoxy is premised. And so what he's saying is that the social cachet of wanting to be a member of an Orthodox community creates this willingness to participate and take on all of the rituals without worrying about the principles of it.
Right. I think that's very true. Now, conscious of time, so what I want is, if that's okay, for Margaret and then Evelyn to Clive, one after the other, to ask your questions. And then if Miri, you can make a note and then answer all three, if you can. So if you could do that. So Margaret, very briefly, Margaret, and then Evelyn, and Clive. So Margaret, do you want to do that?
It's very difficult to compare England to Israel. I can't speak for America or any other European country. We are bound by the Constitution of the United Synagogue that if we want to be buried in this country, we have to belong to United Synagogue, which ties our hands enormously. In Israel, these restrictions are extremely different. They will be buried by the state. There are enough schools in Israel for whichever denomination you wish to belong to. It's a much more pluralistic society, a slightly less judgmental society. This society is extremely judgmental, and you're identified by which synagogue you go to, which school you go to, etc., etc. Also, I hate the word Haredi because in some circles I'm considered Haredi and I'm not. So I'm very worried about the use of that word, especially these days. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a good point. Although I think numbers plays a large part to do with Israel as well. When you have a lot of numbers, you have also, much more going on. Evelyn, over to you.
Just a very quick question. In the beginning, if I understood you correctly, Miri, you were speaking about the influence of theology on Anglo-Jewry. But then, unless I missed something, the conversation seemed to segue into a different discussion about the role of political authority or religious political authority and its waxing and waning. Now, I can understand there's one relationship, this is not my field, but I see one relationship in that institutions which to maintain themselves by their nature. So a lot of it we could explain or start to explain that way, but I'd love to hear at least a tiny bit more about what you see the connections between the two, because I thought we lost that strain of conversation a bit.
Okay, that's important to hear, absolutely. And Clive, just your short thing, and then Miri can respond.
Many of us come from Orthodox backgrounds, and we're also secularly well educated, and therefore we're attracted by any movement that indicates that we're going to have a more broad-minded, less gender-based religion. But where do you see in that context perhaps a much greater strength than the partnership minyan in terms of impact of outreach movements that are more inward-looking, like JLE or like Aish or like Lubavitch? They say they're outward-looking, but actually they're driving people back to what you said were the three values of ritual, of Torah learning, and of community, and evidently having more success than any of the initiatives that we broad-minded people would celebrate.
All right, there we go. Polite question from Clive there as well. Okay, there you go. Over to you. You can choose to ignore or focus on any of those three that you want, because the conch is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to start with the outreach one because it came last, so it's freshest in my mind and raises. They all are interesting questions. The appeal of the outreach model of JLE, Chabad, etc. I think actually precisely speaks to that post-secular context that I was talking about earlier, that in which there is clearly a new space that has been carved out, in which there is a yearning to try to tap into religion more, but which challenges the United Synagogue model, but actually therefore can increase the appeal of a more outreach focused, that's inward thinking in the type of engagement with Judaism that it provides. What I'd suggest is that precisely what we can see is something of it's more than binary, but I think the point is we can identify sort of at least two trajectories where there's because of this yearning for religion, for faith, for meaning, for spirituality, the term, the jingoistic academic terminology is sacralization over secularization. So it's a seeking out of the sacred. So that yearning for the sacred, undoubtedly leads to an appeal for an inward focused religious interpretation that offers you a black and white approach that says this is right and this is wrong, and if you engage in these rituals, study and community, then you will gain all the answers that you wish for. You will have the opportunity to find that sacred voice that you're seeking out, and it has an enormous appeal. But equally, there is an appeal, I believe, and exactly as you said here, for that more sort of partnership minyan model as well, that is suggesting that there is the possibility, by engaging in those same three building blocks of ritual, study and community, for suggesting that there is the possibility for thinking more creatively. What's missing out, what's losing attraction and losing the numbers, is the established mainstream, which is precisely unwilling to offer either sort of approach. But as I say, I mean, you know, that's narrowing it down. There are alternatives as well, but I think that's what explains the appeal of the outreach model. Now, the brief comment on Haredi, the term Haredi. I actually encourage my non-Jewish students to use the term Haredi over ultra-Orthodoxy, because actually I think the term ultra-Orthodoxy is problematic, not least because it precisely feeds into that understanding that the Haredi community is the authentic defender of Orthodox Judaism and everything else represents a compromise. That's what's implicit in the term ultra-Orthodoxy, to my mind. Whereas the term Haredi, I think, is actually can be more inclusive and just identifies an approach to interpreting Jewish teachings that emphasizes this fear of God and all that follows from that, and ultimately, actually, I think it also reflects the role of fear in more general terms, but that's another topic entirely. Burial rites and the sort of the greater pluralism in Israel. I'm pretty sure it was you, Rafi, a conversation we had many years ago, suggesting that if Limmud set up its own burial institute fellowship, it would destroy the United Synagogue. And it struck me.
I may have said that.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
It's all right. I was just exploring possibilities. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, it struck me as it, you know, I still remember it. It struck me as an incredibly powerful, important point, that it again, it goes back to the control that the establishment institutions of British Jewry, but again, I would emphasize British society as a whole has traditionally encouraged British citizens to sort of bow down to and accept the authority of. That has informed a lot of the way in which, as I say, British society as a whole responds, and the opportunities for creativity flow from the emergence of challenges to that. Then the final question was the one from Evelyn about asking me to come back to the question of theology and the role. I think the role of theology in influencing, I guess really in influencing halachic psak, rather than, you know, offering the opportunities to move away from questions of religious authority. And again, this goes back to the models, for example, of the likes of Yitz Greenberg, or going back, the likes of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. It is precisely when you have that strong theology that you're willing, I think, to innovate and be creative in the way in which you approach halacha. When you focus, perfect example of someone whose theology I didn't necessarily entirely agree with is Jacobowitz, Emmanuel Jacobowitz, who I mentioned earlier. One of the most striking things about Jacobowitz's chief rabbinate, which was sort of brought even more to the fore by what happened before and after, was the way in which he had such a strong belief in his personal theology, which was actually a very Hirschian theology of Torah derech eretz, that it drove him to engage in disputes that didn't bother him. He was unwilling to back down against authority figures, against his Bet Din, against other bodies, against the United Synagogue, when he believed he had right on his side. And I think that's kind of a perfect example of how theology can drive and bring about change. But all too often, it becomes instead a question of, it's turkeys voting for Christmas.
That's interesting. I mean, I see that more personality than theology, but I can see your point in there. I'm just conscious of time, but there's one more question I'm going to ask from Leanne, which is on the chat, and then I think we'll officially wrap up. But we can stay on the chat till the cows come home. Miri, Leanne says, would you agree that the lack of creativity in the United Synagogue is due to the power of the Dayanim over the chief rabbi? Do you envisage a time when this might be reversed? Not a contentious question at all. Thank you, Leanne.
Well, so the truth is that my book on Orthodox Judaism in Britain precisely examined the shift that took place in British Orthodoxy, in which the transition in power of the Bet Din over the chief rabbinate occurred. It had a lot to do with Dayan Abramsky and the power he wielded. And the irony is that he was able to wield that power because he was brought in by Robert Whaley Cohen, who wanted to undermine the authority of Chief Rabbi Hertz. Whaley Cohen was by no means, he was president of the United Synagogue at the time. He was by no means Orthodox. He wanted to actually create all sorts of alliances. He wanted to make Jews college, train reform rabbis, etc., etc., etc. But he was the one, in a wonderful irony, that brought in Dayan Abramsky because he saw in Dayan Abramsky someone who could challenge Hertz, which was a very hard thing to do. The famous story about Hertz is that he would always seek a peaceful means of ending an argument once all sort of argumentative approaches had failed. But that was where the shift took place. And going back to Jacobowicz's chief rabbinate, it was one of the striking things that Jacobowicz, because he wasn't viewed as a United Synagogue sort of appointee, because his religious home was obviously in the Adass rather than the United Synagogue, he was treated with a lot more respect by the Bet Din than was subsequently the case when Rabbi Sachs came into the post of chief rabbi. I have to say, I think one of Jonathan Sachs's biggest mistakes in his chief rabbinate was his decision to go and study for a year before taking up the post of chief rabbi, because he felt that he needed to improve his lomdus, so to speak, to be able to gain more respect from his Bet Din, because precisely what that indicated was a failure on his part to understand that why he was being appointed as chief rabbi. That he wasn't being appointed as chief rabbi to challenge his Bet Din in terms of his lomdus. He was being appointed as chief rabbi in order to represent that sort of educated, modern Orthodox British Jewry that was emerging and growing and had the potential to grow further. And so I feel that actually a lot of the decisions that were made during his chief rabbinate, which continue to give more power to the Bet Din, served to further the model that Dayan Abramsky had already brought in at a much earlier stage. And the only chances of that changing are, I mentioned the importance of new rabbis being brought in to change the religious spectrum of British Orthodoxy. The same undoubtedly has been the case for decades with the Bet Din, to actually have a Bet Din that reflects the needs of mainstream Orthodoxy rather than, it goes back to the point you made earlier, Rafi, about the Kinlos review and the importance of people saying that they wanted their shul to be respected and for people to be able to come along. And that's sort of the driver of the Bet Din being, as far more Haredi than the community that it's actually meant to be serving. And that goes back to the questions of creativity in Israel and America. You don't have the same centralized Bet Din, asserting that authority, certainly in the American scene. And actually the role of the Bet Din in Israel is part of where the challenges actually increase.
Well, thank you, Miri. That's, fascinating, challenging stuff, huge issues, and we can carry on. We will carry on. I'm just going to do an official summary. If you want to leave, we can chat more. But a couple of comments just along the way, which is that, as your books come out, what I wonder, what I hope is, are the board of the United Synagogue, or even the board of Central Square, reading books on theology about these views? Are United Synagogue rabbis reading these things? Because these are the people that have power now. Part of my feeling is that, the lack of education in our community is so strong now that the people in leadership positions in the United Synagogue don't have the knowledge to feel they can stand up to the rabbis. So they just don't feel. They might be politically strong or confident as people, but they don't feel they can argue because they don't think they know as well. So I wonder if these books being read, and I think it's important that your approach and just openness to understanding history and the alternatives are read and thought about. And I'll make sure that people will definitely have your book at the college and other people selling it. And these people need to talk about these issues so they're more aware of it. That's what I'd like to see. But I always worry if people will or won't, or as I said, Anglo Jewish is so bruised from its political history that it's kind of nervous of those things and wants a nice quiet life. There's a kind of inherent conservatism, who knows? Anyway, fascinating. Please stay on because I think people still like to talk and chat, but people feel free, you can go if you want. But if you've got more questions, then feel free to unmute and ask Miri because she's got nothing better to do. I'm sure she's finished Bridgerton already, and so she's got nothing better to do than staying and answer your questions. So who wants to ask next?
Just before we go, can I give an ad for next week's session before people
leave? Sure, Ben, go on.
Next week, we've got a session from a nice Jewish boy from the suburb who's made a good living out of fraud. And before you get the wrong idea, he's the deputy director of the National Economic Crime Centre at the National Crime Agency. His name's Ben Russell.
Yeah, it should be really interesting in terms of how those things are working, and hopefully
actually
Jewish names will come up. Yeah, go
on. Yes, indeed. And I should actually publicize I'm speaking at JW3 next Monday, the 8th, February 8th, on faith in lockdown. So I should advertise that as well.
Definitely. Okay, I'll put that down. Any more questions? Anybody want to ask? If you want to go on.
Miri, fascinating talk, and thank you very much for it. I'm interested in what you think. I'm interested in the practical reaction to external events that affect the Jewish community. And in particular, Shechita is the thing that's uppermost in my mind. And, if there is a law passed, right, as it has been in lots of places in Europe, where stunning is required, right? Do you think that within the London Bet Din or even in the Haredi community, right, there's going to be at least an analysis of whether some form of stunning will be permitted? Or do you think they're just going to go back and say, sod you, we're not, we're going to stick to our own rules and customs and break the rules if necessary?
Yeah. I think the reality is that I think there will be a reluctance to look at the halachic flexibility that exists on addressing that question. That's the real politic response. Well, one of the favorite essays I have, which I set for my students when I'm teaching them, just a paper on modern Judaism, is precisely to consider the sort of the ethics of halakha, of the laws of kashrut, and the possibility for what scope there is in halakha for an eco-kashrut approach. Which precisely encourages them to look and consider the scope that does exist when we wish to identify. It goes back to the turkeys voting for Christmas comment and the challenge between religious authority versus halakha, the willingness, theology, the willingness to think creatively when there is an entrenched power and all that comes from that. So that's my answer.
Any other questions? Anybody want to ask? David, I can see you're raising your hand.
I am. Hi, Miri. How are you doing?
Hi, David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lovely to see you.
And you. My question is sort of touched on what Evelyn was saying a bit. You started sort of esoterically, as it were, with theology and then halakha, and then we ended up with sort of basic politics. I was wondering about what I could call the sociological and ideas of community, because we made quite a few generals, like the British all think this, but there is something here maybe about community and how communities behave that might inform this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to my interest in a Hirschian model of orthodoxy, there's a fascinating study that was done by David Ellenson, who compared the sort of models of a modern Orthodox Judaism that were constructed by Hirsch and Hildesheimer in the 19th century German context. And what Ellenson did in that article was he examined the influence on a Hirschian modern orthodoxy of the approach that Hirsch sort of simultaneously tried to balance with his Torah and Derech Eretz theology of his battle for the right for his Orthodox community to secede from the overarching Jewish community in Frankfurt, his particular community. So just a very brief bit of background for those who don't know the details on this. So the nature of the legislative setup of German society was that you had to be a member. This goes back to the point about the importance of synagogue membership in Britain. In Britain, being a member of the Jewish community has always been a voluntary choice. And that's why synagogue membership became important as a way of bringing in the money that is needed to provide for the community. In Germany, you had to be a member of your religious group, and that religious group was able to levy taxes in order to provide the services for the community. And Hirsch's argument was that his battle to defend Torah and Derech Eretz was, on the one hand, a battle to defend the legitimacy of such an approach to interpreting an Orthodox Judaism, but on the other hand, was also intended to negate the validity of Reform Judaism as a valid option. And so to give money to a centralized community fund, which was then going to give some of its resources to the Reform community and some of its resources to an Orthodox community, was something he was unwilling to accept. And therefore, he battled for the right to secede. As an aside, of course, it's an interesting point that he was empowered. This goes back to questions of how we approach theology and understand the context in which it comes out. He was empowered to engage in this battle because his independent community had the financial resources so that it didn't need to rely on the taxes from the central fund. And so, we have to consider that as a contributing factor. But the point is, what that meant was that in sociological terms, as Ellenson studies in this article, Hirsch ended up constructing a theology that was simultaneously trying to be church-like, which meant it was outward facing. It was trying to engage in the surrounding society and trying to show the possibilities for an Orthodox Judaism that engaged with the Derech Eretz, hence the Torah and Derech Eretz model, whilst at the same time being sectarian in its approach within the Jewish community as a whole, in rejecting the validity of Reform Judaism. And that effort simultaneously to balance the open church-like stance with the sectarian, inward-facing, boundary line marking stance was very corrosive and very difficult to sustain and move forward goes back to the point I was making about the importance of a theology, for it to be a good theology, to be transmissible. And so the challenge of specifically the Hirschian model was this battle for secession. And actually, going back to Jacobowitz, one of the interesting things about Jacobowitz's Torah and Derech Eretz theology was that it drew not from the Hirschian secessionist model, but actually from the Hildesheimer Berlin community integrationist Großgemeinde approach, which actually emphasized the value of thinking about the community as a whole. And that was an important sort of driver in Jacobowicz's chief rabbinate.
So you say, Miri, I mean, I'll say from a kind of a pragmatic point of view, you know, if you try and fight on two fronts, as the Germans discovered, you often lose. In fact, that's what Chovevei Torah had in the States when they took on biblical criticism and feminism and women rabbis. That's when the mainstream Orthodoxy, and they're still trying to literally alienate them. And maybe that's the heart of the problem of modern Orthodoxy. You know, it tries to show that it's not, that it's authentic and therefore not like the Reform. And it tries to show that it's modern and not like the Orthodox. And you'll always lose if you try and fight on two fronts. And it's defined in difference from other as opposed to in and of itself. And that's why I, fundamentally, as you know, is a huge fan of Rabbi Sachs, who very early on said when I took over at SJS Jewish College, said, Rafi, don't give class a modern Orthodoxy, show them how we learn. Do it assertively as opposed to reactively, because otherwise you'll always end up with these kind of issues. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, and well, I've been struck in a number of the comments since the untimely passing of Rabbi Sachs. His critique of trying to claim the label of modern Orthodoxy, that it's so narrow and so limiting. Why focus on trying to defend and promote a modern Orthodoxy? Let's actually have this much bigger vision of what a Judaism committed, and it goes back to a Judaism that's committed to ritual study and community, has this capacity to actually embrace so much more. And when you start from those parameters, I think you have the flexibility actually to go far.
Yeah, I agree. And by his last few years, he called it Judaism engaged with the world. Instead of being defensive, he just went out there and did it. And I think that, and people got excited by that approach and stuff. But it avoided a lot of the political issues, which him personally wasn't so into doing, but also strategically was maybe a good place to go. A couple more questions. We have to end, but if any of this people still, I'm watching numbers going. They're not going down as fast as they normally do. So if people have a couple more questions, Linda, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, can I ask something? Miri, just one of the markers of identity nowadays in the community, I think, is often sending kids to Jewish schools. And I think to some extent that might have affected shul membership. It's very much a marker of identity nowadays, and schools have often become the new communities. Do you think that's valid?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it goes back to what I was saying about Jacobowicz's chief rabbinate and how important that was. Actually, one of the ways in which he was empowered to plow his own path was by being so driven by fostering the growth of Jewish schools. It's one of the points I make in my book on Orthodox Judaism in Britain. That Hertz's theology, similarly to Jacobowicz, was driven by a focus on religious education. But Hertz notably failed to actually find the tools to implement it and to set up the schools and actually create the possibilities for teaching the type of Judaism he wanted to promote, whereas Jacobowicz did do that. So I do think the shift in the entire approach of British Jewry to recognizing the importance of Jewish schools has played an important role in altering understandings of the primacy of synagogue membership. But as I say, I think actually the challenge to synagogue membership is also just part of a broader phenomenon where there is this shift that we can see, which is not just even in Britain. We see it certainly across Europe. We can see it in America. Again, not just in terms of Jewish communities, but in terms of the role of religion in life. There's this growth of a yearning for the sacred, but an increasing willingness to seek that outside of established institutions.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Any more questions? Are we there? Oh, well, I think we've come to an end. Okay, natural thing. Thank you, Miri. And we'll put up information about your books and your thinking, and it's important that you're here. Don't go off to the States, please. Daniel moans there as well. I went to visit him last summer, and he moans a lot about being there as well as other things. So thank you so much for your thoughts and your challenges, and encouraging us to have a have thinking from the neck up and to be reading and to know these issues. And tonight, anybody, if you didn't know who Hildesheimer are or Hertz or these issues, that's the point she's trying to make. We've got to learn ourselves up on these issues so we understand the origins of our orthodoxy and not think it's always been thus. So thanks very much. Good night all. Thanks, Miri. And we'll have a good week.
Thank you. Shabbat Tov, everybody.
Shabbat Tov.
Thank you so much.
Be well. Bye-bye then.
Thank you.